Pointing across the room at the equation chalked halfway to a finish on the blackboard, she told him to complete it, right there in front of everyone, and she would resign as department chair the moment he did. 200 students went silent. At the front of Whitmore Hall stood a man in a faded gray uniform, chalk dust pale across his knuckles, facing the university's most celebrated young professor. Nobody in the room knew his name yet. 20 minutes ago, none of it had happened at all. There had only been an unfinished proof left on the blackboard, on purpose, and one name on a night access log nobody had checked in 11 years. Vivian Marsh reached Whitmore Hall at 7:42 that morning, coffee in hand, the same as every morning for 8 years. She unlocked the lecture room without looking up from her notes. She looked up the moment she reached the board. Chalk covered its full width, edge to edge, in handwriting she did not recognize. A topology proof, elegant, precise, missing only its final step, the kind of gap left by someone confident enough to leave a question open. One number caught her eye before the rest, a 7, slanted at an angle she had seen somewhere before and could not place. She set her coffee down without drinking it. 200 students would fill this room in 18 minutes. One name was posted on the night access log by the east wing door. Elliot Cross, custodian, 11 years. By 8 o'clock the room was full, and the proof still stood uncleaned behind her. Vivian did not explain what it was. She asked for Elliot Cross to be sent for. He arrived pushing a supply cart he had not finished loading, chalk dust still faint on the back of his right hand from the night before. 200 students turned to look at him. He did not look at any of them. He looked at the board. Vivian asked if he had written the proof. He said that he had. She asked if he understood what he had left unfinished. He said that he did, and that he had left it unfinished on purpose because he had not yet found a clean way to close it. The room went quiet in a way 200 students rarely managed on their own. Vivian's voice was steady when she gave him the terms, already decided before she chose to speak them. Finish the proof, in this room, in front of this class, before the term ended, and she would resign her position as department chair on the spot. A murmur rolled through the hall. Near the back, someone laughed once, short and nervous, the kind of laugh that fills a silence nobody knows what to do with. Elliot set the cart against the wall. He crossed the room slower than the moment called for, and stopped at the chalk tray beneath the board. His fingers found the worn groove along its edge before his eyes did, a groove cut into the wood by 20 years of hands resting exactly there, waiting to be called on. For less than 3 seconds, he was 18 again, standing in this same spot, certain the whole world was still in front of him. He let the memory go before it finished forming. Vivian kept talking, laying out a date, a witness list. Elliot was not listening to most of it. He was looking at the one line he had left open the night before, the gap he had never once let himself believe anyone would ask him to close. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk. "I'll take the wager." The night before, at 11 minutes past midnight, Whitmore Hall belonged to nobody but Elliot Cross. The fluorescent lights in the east wing hallway hummed at a pitch only noticeable in the absence of every other sound, and Elliot had long since stopped noticing it at all. He pushed his cart past the same lecture room doors he passed every night, the same rhythm, the same 14 steps between the stairwell and the supply closet, until he reached the one door he always left for last. He let himself into the empty lecture hall and set his cart against the wall. He did not turn on the main lights. He never did. He crossed to the board under the single working fixture above the podium, picked up a piece of chalk from the tray, and began where he had left off the night before, on a proof he had first tried to solve when he was 18 years old and had never quite put down since. He worked for 40 minutes, filling the board twice over, erasing each version with the flat of his palm before starting the next. Tonight, on the third attempt, he stopped 2 lines from the end and did not finish it. He looked at the gap he had left standing open. He did not erase it. He gathered his cart and made his way down to the ground floor break room, where the duty clipboard hung beside the time clock, the same as it had every night for 11 years. Pinned to it tonight was a large cream-colored envelope, official letterhead visible through the corner, and a small sticky note in the day supervisor's block handwriting. Came by hand this afternoon, looked important, made sure it didn't walk off. Elliot unpinned it and turned it over. The seal was a standard notary imprint, raised letters pressed into the paper rather than sealed in wax, the kind of mark he had seen 100 times on tenant leases and inspection reports left behind by contractors. He ran his thumb once across the raised letters out of habit and slid the envelope into his back pocket to open at the end of his shift. He made it only as far as the stairwell before he stopped and pulled it back out. Inside was a formal letter from a law office 2 towns over, addressed to him by his full legal name, a detail that, alone, was enough to make his hands go still. Paper-clipped to the back of it was a second, smaller piece of paper, much older, folded into quarters, the kind of onion skin stationery nobody had manufactured in years. The clip had left a faint rust-colored ring pressed into the corner, as though it had been holding these 2 pages together for a very long time. He unfolded the older page first. The paper gave off a dry, faintly bitter smell when it opened, ink that had sat sealed away far longer than the 6 weeks the letter behind it would later explain. He knew that smell. It was the same smell that used to rise off the stacks of second-hand textbooks a retired professor kept in his office 2 floors above the math department 20 years ago, back when that professor spent every Tuesday afternoon teaching a scholarship student for free because the boy could not afford the tutoring center down the street. Elliot had not smelled paper like that since the week he left this university for good. The formal letter explained what the older page did not. Professor Aldous Reyes had passed away 6 weeks earlier. The letter did not soften the fact or wrap it in condolence beyond a single formal line. It stated, instead, plainly, that the late professor had left a box of personal papers to be collected by one Elliot Cross, and that the terms of collection required him to appear in person at the mathematics department during business hours within 30 days. Elliot read the line twice. He read the professor's name a 3rd time, as if repetition might change what it meant. He had spent 11 years walking past that department's doors every single night without once opening them. He folded both pages back along their original creases, careful with the older one, and returned them to the envelope. He finished the rest of his route the way he always did, methodical, unhurried, betraying nothing. But when he returned to the lecture hall one last time before clocking out, he did not erase the board. He stood in front of the gap he had left 2 lines from the end, chalk still resting in the tray where he had set it down hours earlier, and for the first time in 11 years, he left his own handwriting standing in a room that was never his to write in. Somebody would find it in the morning. He locked the door behind him anyway. The mathematics department occupied the same 3 floors it always had, and Elliot had not set foot inside them in 20 years. He stood at the entrance the following afternoon in his own clothes rather than his uniform, the envelope folded into the inside pocket of a jacket he rarely wore, and let himself look at the building the way a person looks at something they had decided long ago not to look at again. The tile pattern in the main hallway had not changed. A crack ran diagonally across the 3rd square from the door, the same crack he used to step over on his way to office hours, a habit his feet remembered before his mind caught up. He stepped over it now without deciding to. The department office had not changed much either, though the receptionist had. She asked his name, checked it against a list, and waited while he slid his driver's license across the counter, its corner worn soft and pale from years in the same jacket pocket. She copied a number off it onto a form without comment and disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a plain cardboard box taped shut, with his name written across the top in a hand he did not recognize, and a single sheet for him to sign. He signed it without reading it closely. His hand was steadier than he had expected it to be. He carried the box to his car, set it on the passenger seat, and pulled the tape free before he had even shut his own door, the cardboard flaps resisting for a moment before giving way all at once. Inside, beneath a folder of what looked like old department memos and a pair of reading glasses still in their case, was a notebook bound in leather that had once been the color of strong tea and had faded over the years to something closer to dust. The spine had cracked along its length, softened by decades of being opened and closed, and the cover gave a small dry sound when Elliot lifted it, like a door that had not been used in a long time. He set the notebook on his lap and took the older page from the envelope out first, the onion skin sheet he had not fully read the night before, only smelled. It was short. Aldous Reyes had written it years before his death, in ink that had gone slightly brown at the edges, and it explained almost nothing, except that Elliot had the notebook whenever the time came, and that he trusted the boy to know what to do with what was inside it better than any lawyer would. There was no date. There was only a single line beneath his signature, added, it seemed, some time later, in a different ink. "I am still waiting on the last page. I think you know which one." Elliot read that line 3 times before he opened the notebook itself. The early entries were dense with equations Elliot recognized immediately. Aldous' small, slanted handwriting working through a proof in topology that Elliot remembered the shape of from 20 years earlier, back when the old man had sketched an early version of it on a napkin during a Tuesday tutoring session and told an 18-year-old boy that it would probably take him the rest of his life to finish it properly. The notebook was proof that it had. Elliot turned pages slowly, watching 4 decades of a man's handwriting change with him, growing shakier in the later years, the ink switching from black to blue to a cheap ballpoint that skipped in places. Somewhere past the middle of the notebook, he began to see his own name. Not written directly at first, a margin note here, a question mark beside a line of proof that read, "Would the boy have seen this faster than I did?" Another, further along, simply, "Wrote to Denise's boy again. No answer." He recognized none of the names except his own, and even that one felt strange to see, written by a hand that had not touched him in 2 decades, in a book that had clearly never been meant for anyone else to read. He reached the final page. The proof stopped 2/3 of the way down, unfinished, the last several lines crossed out and rewritten twice before being abandoned altogether. Beneath the crossed-out lines, in handwriting far steadier than the rest of the notebook, as though written in a single, unhurried sitting, was a note. "To my quietest student," it read, "the one who saw the right direction before I did, and left before either of us could finish what we started." Elliot sat with the notebook open on his lap for a long time. There was no name written beside the note, no confirmation, nothing that would hold up as proof in any formal sense. But he did not need proof. He knew the handwriting. He knew the napkin this proof had started on. He knew the Tuesday afternoons, the free tutoring sessions, the boy who had shown up because he could not afford anything else, and had left, eventually, without saying goodbye properly to the one person in this building who had ever treated him like he belonged in it. He turned back several pages, looking for the exact point where the proof took the turn he remembered suggesting once, 20 years ago, half joking, certain at the time that the old man had not really been listening. The page was gone. Not blank, gone, cut cleanly from the binding, a thin, ragged edge left behind where it had been, the kind of tear that happens slowly, deliberately, not by accident. Elliot ran his thumb along the torn edge, and it caught slightly on a raised seam of paper the scissors or blade had left behind. Whatever had been on that page, Aldous had not wanted it left in the notebook. He was the one. By 10 that night, Elliot was back inside Whitmore Hall, but not in the lecture room this time. He sat at a study table in the library's 3rd-floor archive, the notebook open in front of him, a legal pad beside it, and the overhead lights switched off, except for the single desk lamp he had turned on above his own head. The rest of the floor stretched out dark around him, rows of shelving disappearing into shadow past the reach of the lamp. A laminated notice was taped to the end of the nearest row, one he had passed a dozen times without reading. The archive floor would close for inventory starting Thursday, 3 days from now, every shelf boxed and sealed for relocation while the university renovated the level below. After Thursday, nobody would be pulling books from these shelves for months. He tried to rebuild the missing page from memory first. He remembered the shape of the argument, or believed he did, the general direction Aldous had been reaching for before the proof broke off. He filled 3 pages of the legal pad with attempts, each one collapsing at the same point, a step that refused to hold no matter which way he approached it. He crossed out the 3rd attempt harder than the first 2, the pen tearing slightly through the paper, and sat back in the chair with his hands pressed against his eyes. 20 years of doing this alone had taught him to trust his own memory over almost anything else. Tonight, memory was not enough. He opened the notebook again, back to the margin note he had read that afternoon in the car. Would the boy have seen this faster than I did? He had read past it the first time, too caught up in the final page to notice what the question was really asking. Aldous had not written it as a passing thought. He had written it the same week Elliot remembered sitting across from him on a napkin-covered table. The same week the old man had pressed a thick used textbook into his hands and told him to read the 3rd chapter before their next Tuesday session, a chapter on classical point-set topology that Elliot, at 18, had found almost insultingly basic. He had not thought about that textbook once in 20 years. He stood, walked directly to the row he remembered from his own years shelving returns on this floor, and found the section without needing to check the call numbers. He knew the shelf. He had walked past it hundreds of times as a student worker without ever looking twice at what was on it. The book was exactly where a book from that era should have been, third from the left, its spine cracked in nearly the same place as the notebooks, its pages carrying the same faint smell of paper that had sat undisturbed for decades. A checkout card slid halfway out of the pocket glued inside the back cover as he opened it, the kind libraries had stopped using years before Elliot had even been born, kept here more as habit than function. He pulled the card the rest of the way out, already certain of what he would find. The last name signed on it, third from the bottom, in handwriting he recognized before he recognized anything else about it, was his own. He had returned this book late that semester. He remembered the fee, $4, paid in quarters he had counted out at the circulation desk because it was all he had on him that week. Aldous had assigned it then, on purpose, knowing exactly which shelf it would return to. Elliot ran his thumb along the spine and found what the card alone had not told him. A second slip of paper had been pressed flat against the inside back cover, beneath the pocket, folded small enough to sit invisible against the binding unless someone went looking for it the way he was going looking now. He worked it free carefully, the paper stiff with age, and unfolded it under the lamp. It was not the missing page. It was a map of the floor he was standing on, hand-drawn, one shelf circled in the same ink as the notebook's final entries. 3 days. He had 3 days before this entire floor disappeared into storage crates. He folded the map into his pocket and started walking toward the circled shelf. The circled shelf turned out not to be a shelf at all, but a locked storage cage built into the back wall of the archive, the kind used for material too fragile or too restricted for open stacks, sealed with a numbered combination lock instead of a key. Elliot stood in front of it for a long moment, the hand-drawn map still open in his palm, and understood that whatever Aldous had hidden behind that wire mesh was not going to come loose by force. He gripped the lock once anyway, testing it, the metal cold enough to sting faintly against his palm. He let go before he pulled harder. He was 3 steps from turning back to his cart when he heard footsteps that were not his own, sharp against the tile, closing the distance faster than someone simply passing through. Vivian stopped at the end of the row, arms crossed, her voice carrying the same flat authority it had carried in front of 200 students 5 days earlier. She asked him what he thought he was doing in a restricted section after hours, and reminded him before he could answer that she had every right to call building security and end this conversation with his badge on her desk by morning. He did not step back from the cage. He said that the notebook had led him here, and that whatever Aldous had hidden behind that lock was very likely the missing ending to the proof standing on the board she had not yet let anyone erase. Something shifted in her expression before she could stop it. She asked what made him so certain. He said he was not certain of anything. He said that was usually the reason worth looking. Her flashlight, still in her hand from crossing the dark stacks, swept once across the aisle as she stepped closer to the cage to examine the lock herself, and caught, for less than a second, the edge of his supply cart parked against the shelving behind him. Beneath a folded stack of cleaning rags, corners squared with the same careful precision she had noticed in the folders at the base of the cage, sat a thick stack of photocopied pages held together with a binder clip, a course number written across the top in handwriting she recognized without wanting to. She said nothing about it. She looked back at the lock instead, turning the dial once out of habit, though she had no more idea of the combination than he did. She told him that restricted archive access could be transferred to the department chair with a single form and a morning phone call, and that she intended to make that call herself first thing. He asked why she would bother, given everything still standing between them. She said it had nothing to do with him. She said that if there was an ending to Aldous Reyes's proof behind that lock, she was not about to let it surface without being the one standing in the room when it did. He studied her for a moment before he answered, long enough that she almost looked away first. He said that was fair. She turned to leave, already 3 steps down the row before either of them said anything else, and stopped once, briefly, at the sound of him speaking behind her. "Ask me why I stayed." She did not ask. She did not need to. When he spoke anyway, there was nothing in his voice that asked for sympathy. He said he had not stayed because the world owed him an explanation, or because 11 years of mopping floors in a building that once knew his name deserved some kind of apology. He said he had stayed because somewhere in this city, 20 years ago, a group of people had decided what he was capable of before he had finished deciding it himself, and he had spent every year since refusing to let that decision be the last word on the matter. He was not looking for anyone to feel sorry for him. He had simply never been willing to let a wrong guess about him stand uncorrected. Vivian did not have a response ready for that either. She drove home without remembering most of the drive and let herself into her apartment sometime after 1 in the morning, dropping her coat over the back of a chair she rarely used for anything else. She meant to go straight to bed. She stopped instead at the hallway closet, where a low wooden dresser had sat for years holding nothing she needed on any regular basis, and pulled open the bottom drawer out of a restlessness she did not examine too closely. The drawer stuck slightly before it gave, wood swollen faintly with age, and released a thin smell of old paper into the room. Beneath a folder of tax documents she had not touched since her last move was a spiral notebook, its cover soft at the corners, a university crest faded almost to nothing in the top corner. Her own handwriting filled most of its pages, dense and cramped in places, the notes of a 22-year-old who had believed there was no such thing as writing too fast. She had not opened it in longer than she could accurately guess. She turned pages without any particular purpose, half expecting nothing but old lecture notes and the occasional margin doodle. Partway through, the handwriting changed. It was not hers. A full page, worked in someone else's hand, slower and more deliberate than her own frantic sprawl, laid out what looked at first like an ordinary proof, the kind students traded back and forth during long study sessions as a kind of dare. She had read it once, 20 years ago, standing in a hallway outside a study room, and laughed at what she assumed was a joke embedded somewhere in the logic, a clever trick meant to make her work harder to find the error. She read it again now, slowly, the way she had never once bothered to read it back then. There was no error. Each step held. Each step led somewhere deliberately toward a conclusion disguised the entire way as an unrelated exercise in variable substitution until the final line resolved itself into something that was not a proof at all. Her own name spelled out in careful mathematical notation. Beneath it, a function he had never finished defining, its final term left as an open variable, followed by a single instruction in his handwriting instead of a number. Solve for what comes next, only if you want to. He had never asked her anything directly in 4 years of knowing him. She understood, sitting on the floor of her own hallway 20 decades later, that this had been the closest he ever came. She thought of the slant of a 7 on a blackboard 5 days earlier, and the shape of a pair of shoulders in a dark archive 2 nights after that, and understood for the first time why neither had fully registered as familiar until now. She had not failed to recognize him. She had simply never let herself finish the thought, 20 years ago or since, because some part of her had always understood exactly how much it would cost her to be right about what he meant by it. She stayed there long after the notebook had gone still in her lap, the hallway dark around her, the drawer still open at her feet. The transfer came through by 9 the next morning. A single form and a phone call, exactly as Vivian had said it would. She met Elliot at the archive cage herself, the new combination written on a scrap of paper she did not need to consult after the second try. The lock gave with a dry, mechanical click, and neither of them reached for the door first. He nodded toward it. She nodded back. They opened it together. Behind the wire mesh was a single sealed folder, and inside it the missing page, its ragged edge matching the tear in the notebook exactly when Elliot held them side by side. Aldous had not hidden it out of secrecy. He had hidden it the way a man hides the one thing he is most afraid of getting wrong, protecting it even from himself. Elliot read it twice in the archive light. He did not say what it meant. He folded it carefully into the notebook and did not offer it to Vivian to read, and she did not ask to see it. There would be a room full of people for that soon enough, and both of them understood without saying so that whatever came next belonged there, not here. 3 days later, on the last morning of the term, Whitmore Hall filled faster than it had the week before. Word had moved through the university the way it always did, faster than any official notice, and by 8 o'clock every seat was taken, students standing along the back wall, a few faculty members Vivian had not invited, finding their way in anyway. Elliot walked to the board carrying nothing but the notebook and a single piece of chalk. He did not look at the crowd, he looked at the board, and began where the semester's proof had stopped, the same elegant, unfinished line still standing where he had left it days earlier. The first step, he wrote, was the one every mathematician in that room had already tried and abandoned years ago, the foundation Aldous had built his entire career on without ever quite finishing it. Elliot's version of it carried one small variation, a substitution nobody in the room had considered, written in the same hand that had shaped every line on this board for 11 years without an audience. A retired professor in the second row leaned forward without a word. The second step folded in the missing page, the one sealed behind a lock for who knows how many years, and for a moment the only sound in the hall was chalk against slate and 200 people forgetting to breathe at the same rate they usually did. Vivian stood near the front, close enough to see every stroke, and found herself tracking each line the way she had tracked equations 20 years earlier, before any of this had a title or a wager attached to it, back when mathematics had simply been the thing she loved before she learned to need being right more than she loved it. The third step was the one Elliot had rebuilt from memory and instinct alone, after the missing page turned out to only confirm what he had already guessed 3 nights earlier in an empty archive. His hand slowed here, not from uncertainty, but from something closer to care, the way a person moves when they are finishing something that took considerably longer than the proof itself to arrive at. Vivian's mouth opened once, an old reflex rising before she caught it, the same instinct that had built her entire career on catching other people's mistakes before they finished making them. She let the breath out instead. She said nothing. She watched. The final line closed cleanly, without flourish. 4 decades of an old man's unfinished work, resolving into a single closed statement on a blackboard in a lecture hall that had never once, in all that time, held his name outside a faculty directory. Elliot set the chalk down. The room stayed silent a moment longer than silence usually lasts, the kind of pause that comes after witnessing something finished rather than won. Vivian was on her feet before anyone else in the room had decided what to do with their hands. She did not wait to see what the crowd would do first. The applause that followed hers came a half-second later, uncertain at first, then entire. She crossed the floor toward him while it was still rising around them, and what she said was not loud enough for the back rows to catch, only for him and for the first few students near the aisle. She told him she had spent years believing a title was the only proof that mattered, and that she had been wrong about that in ways she was only now old enough to measure. She told him she meant to keep her word on the chair, today in front of everyone. Elliot looked down at the notebook in his hands, then at the chalk still resting in the tray. He told her, without any weight of anger behind it, that he had no use for her chair, and that whatever credit belonged to what had just happened on that board belonged to a man who had spent 40 years earning it and never once asked to be thanked. He said it the way a person closes a door quietly instead of letting it slam. For Aldous. The lecture hall emptied slowly, students lingering in a way they rarely did after class, trading versions of what they had just watched as they filed out into the hallway. Vivian stayed near the board a moment longer than she meant to, and by the time she looked up again to find him, the supply cart was gone from where he had left it against the wall. She checked the custodial office on her way out, expecting him to find there, finishing whatever remained of his shift, as though nothing unusual had happened that morning. The supervisor at the desk told her, without much interest, that Elliot Cross had submitted his resignation in writing the day before, effective immediately, no notice period requested and none required after 11 years of service. The supervisor added, almost as an afterthought, that the letter had been dated 2 days before the lecture, which meant he had decided to leave before he had any way of knowing whether the proof would hold. Vivian stood in the doorway of that office longer than the information alone seemed to warrant. She spent the rest of the morning telling herself there was nothing left to resolve. She had said what needed saying in front of 200 people. He had said what he needed to say back. A resignation, however oddly timed, was his decision to make, and chasing down a man who had made a point of leaving quietly was not the kind of gesture that belonged to the version of herself she was still learning how to be. She found herself in the student union basement by early afternoon anyway, following a hallway she had not walked in years, toward a door marked "Undeliverable Mail, Records Retained." The clerk who unlocked it for her explained, without being asked, that the university had kept every piece of misaddressed or unclaimed campus mail since the 70s, boxed by year, mostly because no one had ever gotten around to approving its disposal. He left her alone with the light switch and a row of steel shelving stretching back further than the door suggested from outside. She had no proof it existed, only a hunch, born out of finally admitting she had been wrong about him for 20 years, urgent enough to send her looking anyway. She found the box for that year with much trouble. It was labeled in hand, in marker that had faded to a pale brown. She worked through it methodically, the way she worked through anything, until her fingers stopped on an envelope near the middle of the stack, its corners soft with 2 decades of undisturbed dust. Her name was on the front, in handwriting she now knew better than her own. The postmark had faded to little more than a smudge, a few numbers still legible if she held it under the single working light overhead, enough to confirm what she already understood without needing confirmation. It had never been opened. It had never even reached the dormitory mailbox it was addressed to, filed instead into a box of undeliverable mail during a summer when half the campus address system had been in the middle of being renumbered, lost in exactly the kind of clerical failure nobody notices until 20 years later. She thought of the slant of a 7 on a blackboard 5 days earlier. She thought of a page in her own old notebook, a question left as an open variable. She understood now that the silence she had spent 20 years reading as rejection had never been silence at all. It had been a letter that never arrived. Vivian did not open it there in the basement under a flickering light, with a clerk waiting somewhere down the hall for her to finish. She held it carefully instead, the way she had learned to hold Aldous' notebook, and climbed the stairs back into daylight with it still sealed in her hand. 20 years late. She did not open it in the basement, and she did not open it in the car on the drive home either. She waited until she was sitting at her own kitchen table, the overhead light on, a cup of coffee going cold beside her that she never touched, before she finally worked her thumb under the flap and tore it along the brittle seam. The handwriting inside was younger than the handwriting she had come to know over the past week, less certain in places, the letters leaning further to the right than they would 20 years later, but unmistakably his. He had written it the week he left the university for good. He did not explain the scholarship, or the pride that had made him refuse it, or any of the reasoning that had cost him everything he might have had here. He wrote that he did not know how to say what he meant without it sounding larger than he had any right to make it sound, and that he had decided in the end it was better to write it down and let her do with it whatever she chose, rather than watch her face while he said it out loud and lose his nerve halfway through. He wrote that 4 years of arguing with her over problem sets had taught him more about himself than anything else at this school ever had. He wrote that he was not leaving because of the scholarship, not really, but because he had looked around one day and realized he did not know how to be someone people believed in without feeling like he owed them something for it, and that the only way he knew to stop feeling that way was to leave before anyone found out how much it had already cost him to stay this long. He wrote, near the bottom, in handwriting that pressed slightly harder into the page than the rest, that if she ever solved the last line of the notebook proof he had left in her margin, she would understand exactly what he had been too young and too proud to say directly. He was not asking her to wait for him. He said he had no right to ask that of anyone. He only wanted her to know, in case it mattered someday, that leaving her was the only part of leaving this place that he had never once stopped regretting. Vivian read the letter twice through, and then a third time, more slowly, and did not cry the way she had expected to. She sat with it a long while instead, the kitchen quiet around her, 20 years finally settling into a shape that made sense. It was the department secretary 2 days later who mentioned, in passing, that Elliot had left a forwarding address for his final paycheck, a community learning center on the east side of the city, the kind of place that ran free evening classes for anyone who wanted them, no admission required, no degree necessary to teach there either. Vivian drove past it that same evening, telling herself she was only confirming the address, nothing more. Through the front window, in a room lit warm and yellow against the coming dark, she could see a small group gathered around a folding table, and at the head of it, chalk in hand, a man in his own clothes for once, no uniform, explaining something to a room full of people who had never once needed a university to tell him he was worth listening to. She did not go in. She stood outside a moment longer, the letter still folded in her coat pocket, and watched him work. She had all the time she needed to decide what came next.